So till now we saw selection statements. Now we will talk of iterative statement or iteration statements. So I'll give you a problem statement. Let's say you have to print numbers from, let's say, 1 to 10,000. So what do I have to do is I simply have to print number 1 from 10,000. So what are the various ways? So what you can do is you can simply do system.out.println and you can write number from 1 to 10,000. But we know that this is something really complex, that we are manually writing number from 1 to 10,000. So as you can see here is that we are doing a kind of repetitive work. What is the repetitive work here? The repetitive work of printing. And there is a pattern here that every time if I have to print 1, 2, 3, 4, so the difference between the two number is 1. So I am doing a repetitive task of printing number here. It's just that the value that I am printing is getting changed after each printing. So for these kind of repetitive tasks, we use iteration statements. So in case of Java, iteration is generally achieved using 4 loops. We have for loops, we have while loop, and we have do while loop, and we have for each. We will discuss for each when we are talking about arrays. We will discuss arrays in the next session. In this particular session, I'll talk about for loop, while loop, and do while loop. So generally, again I'm repeating, these are used for doing a task that is something repetitive. So let's start with this particular question and let's see that if I have to use while loop, how do I solve this problem? Do while, how do I solve? And for also, how do I solve? So let's start with while loop. So I'm again repeating the problem statement. Print numbers from 1 to 1000. Let's say 10,000. So now let's see how do I get this using while loop. So let's write the program for that. So let's say we have public static void main, and then I have now let's write the code for this. So what will I do? I will take an integer I will initialize I with 1, and then we have a while here. While is the keyword, and then we have a condition here. Just like we had condition if, we have a condition here. So we have to decide several things in while, that what will be my initialization, what will be my condition, and what will be my statements inside while. So here what will I do? What I have to do is I have to print I. So what will I do? I will simply do sysout number is, let's say I do I. Now you must be thinking that how the I will get incremented, or for that matter how using just one variable I will print all the numbers from 1 to 10,000, and how do we know that this particular thing will run only till 10,000? So there are two things that we have to do here. First is that we have to ensure that I prints all the numbers from 1 to 10,000, and second, that somehow this loop, we are saying that this is something that is repetitive. This will be getting executed again and again. So my second agenda is to run the loop only till I have printed 10,000. Fine. So let's see how do we do this. First, let's take care of this. So what I can do is that once I have printed I, now I have already printed I, what do I have to do? What we can do is that we can increment I. So what happens is that this I gets incremented, so this will be taken care of. Now what I have to do is I have to run the loop only till I have printed 1000. So for this I put a condition here that I should be less than equal to 10,000. So let's see now that how this code runs for while loop. So now I have initialized I is equal to 1. What will happen? This is the while keyword. The flow of execution comes here. It checks this particular condition. Whatever is the condition here, it checks. If this is true, which is in this case I is less than equal to 10,000, this while block gets executed. So inside this while block, what will happen? First this out gets executed. So let's say I don't have this number is, I am just printing I. So what happens that I gets printed. And what is the value of I here? 1. Now what happens? I gets incremented. This is what we are doing. We are incrementing I by 1. So I gets incremented. Now the value of I is 2 for us. So again, what happens now? You have to see that I gets incremented. Now after all these statements have been executed inside this particular block, the control goes back to here. The control goes back to here. Now here again, this particular condition is checked. That is this condition still true, or after I have incremented the I, it might happen that condition is false. So again I is checked here for the value. I is 2 now. I again see that I is less than equal to 10,000. This is true. So again what will happen? This block gets executed. Again this particular sys out is executed. Now since my I is 2 gets printed. Again I gets incremented. Now my I becomes 3. Again we come back here, we check the condition. Yes, my I is less than equal to 10,000. Again this gets executed, 3 is printed. Again I is incremented to 4. So similarly this keeps on happening. So that's why we call this as a loop. So this particular thing of keeps on happening, and 4, 5, 6, 7 keeps on printing until my I becomes 10,000. So let's say my I becomes 10,000. What happens? We come here again, we check I is less than equal to 10,000. Yes, I is equal to 10,000. Again this is true. So this block gets executed, 10,000 gets printed. Now I gets incremented, and now my value of I becomes 10,001. Now what happens? Again we go here. Now this condition becomes false. Since I is now no more less than equal to 10,000. I is having the value of 10,001, which is greater than 10,000. So now what happens that this condition becomes false, and no more this loop gets executed. So let's say what happens, that we come out of this particular loop, and whatever statement after this, let's say there is one more statement, sys out printed. Let's say this is the statement. So as soon as we come out of the loop, this particular statement gets executed. So this is how while loop works. So let's see quickly the syntax for while loop. So now let's talk about the syntax of while loop. So in while we have a while keyword, we have a condition, then we have our while block, or let's say the loop, and this loop runs only till this condition is true. Now the condition is generally on some variable or something. So let's say the condition is on some variable. So generally what we need to do is we need to initialize this variable, and we also need to keep on updating the variable. So if I go back to the previous slide, here my variable was I. The condition was based on the value of this variable. So here I was initializing the variable, and here I was updating the variable. So generally, depending upon depending upon question, certain things change. But generally how it happens is that this condition is based on value of some variable, and somewhere you have to initialize. So initialization is generally done before this while loop. Initialization is generally done before this while loop, and generally the updating is done inside the loop only. So this is how it generally goes. Again, depending upon the problem statement, things might change. Now, this is how while loop goes. So you will use while loop whenever you have a something repetitive thing to do. Now let's say I come across a scenario in which I want to execute my loop, or let's say I want to execute this particular block irrespective of whether the condition is true or false. So it does not matter whether the condition is true or false. I just want that my loop should run at least once. So in such scenarios we use do while. So let's see what is do while loop. So do while loop goes something like this. So now let's see the syntax for using do while. So for do while, code generally goes like this. We have a keyword do, then we have the body of the loop. Then after this body we have a while keyword and we have the condition. So again in this it might happen that the condition is based on some variable or value of a particular variable. So we initialize it, we can initialize it here also, or maybe inside, or we can also update it. So that depends upon the problem statement. So what is the difference between while and do while is that in do while does not matter whether the condition is true or false. The loop will execute at least once. So let's say I write a code int I equal to 10, then I write do, then I have let's say sysout I, and then we have a condition that let's say I do the condition that I should be less than 10 and I put a semicolon here. So what happens in case of do while is that first the body of the loop gets executed and then the condition is checked. So what will happen? I will get initialized to 10, we will come inside the loop, then we have sysout I, so 10 gets printed, and then the while loop condition is checked that whether I is less than 10 or not. So here I is not less than 10, so the loop breaks. So this is one of the major difference between while and do while, that irrespective of what is the condition, do while runs at least once. So if we have a several scenario where we want our loop to run at least once for sure, then we use do while. So now as you might have seen that in while and do while we are doing initialization at a separate place. Maybe we are doing let's say we have update variable here, we are updating variable at a separate place, and we also have a condition at separate place. So now let's go on to see the for loop. Now let's talk about for loop, and here let's go back to the problem statement that I have to print numbers from 1 to 10,000. So now let's say I write code for this using for loop. So what happens in a for loop is we have a for keyword here, we do the initialization of the variable, then we put the condition that this should be less than equal to 10,000, and then the variable is updated in the same line. So we have the initialization here, this is the initialization, this is the condition, and this is the, let's say I'll call this as update or the counter. So this is how the first line of for looks. After this I have to give the body of the loop. So how do I give the body? So I have for I equal to 1, I less than equal to 10,000, I plus plus. Now the body of loop goes something like this. Let's say I do sysout I. So this is about for loop. Now let's see how for loop runs. So for loop, what happens is that first this initialization is done, I is equal to 1 is done, then this condition is checked. This condition is checked, this condition is true. Now as soon as the condition is true, what happens? We come here, the for loop body is executed. So once it is executed once, let's say I print 1, then this initialization statement, this is executed only once at the beginning of the loop. So I'll say this is executed only once at the beginning of the loop. And this particular update statement is not executed at the beginning of the loop. So it starts getting executed from the second iteration. So as soon as once the body of the loop is executed, 1 is printed. Now execution goes here, I is incremented. Now my I becomes 2. Now after I has incremented, we came here, my I is incremented. Now we come back here. We check for the condition that since I is incremented, is it still less than equal to 10,000? Yes, it is. So we come back here, the body of the loop gets executed, 2 gets printed. Now again after 2 gets printed, we come back here in the increment statement. Now after this is done, I gets incremented to 3, this loop is checked, this condition is checked, 3 gets printed. So this is how the control goes on. This is done, I'm repeating, this is done only once, and after this initialization is done, for execution of every loop, this keeps on getting on incremented and this condition keeps on getting checked. So this was about for loop. So this is how we solved that particular problem of solving number from printing number from 1 to 10,000. So generally we don't use do while unless we have a scenario where we have to execute the loop for at least for once. Apart from that, we generally use while loop and for loop. So this was all about loops. So whatever we have seen till now were single loops. Now we are going to talk about nested loops. So let's talk about nested loop.